So I think we are actually now live. As I did say, soft start, and this is indeed a soft start. Alistair, Kelly, hello.
Hello.
Hello. Wait a minute. I can do once. Tell you what. Before I press the button that means all of us will appear, I'll just say, can everyone? Is the sound coming through? People in the YouTube chat. Hello, people in the YouTube chat. Is the sound coming through? When it is, let me know. Marvelous. I think everything's running as ever. Highly professional. There we go. I'll just do out my obligatory "We are live" tweet, and that's it. Yes, people can hear us. Right, marvelous. Right, I'm gonna. This is new territory. Everyone in the chat, because I'm gonna press this and hopefully it won't break. I think it's worked. Hello, Alistair and Kelly. Hello. We have Alistair and Kelly are here too. Alistair Baldwin and Kelly Shuttleworth are here. Actually, Alistair and Kelly, would you like to introduce yourselves first before we crack on? Kelly, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Kelly. I'm a research assistant at the Institute for Government, and we're kind of junior researcher on this paper. And then, currently working on devolution. I'm not a transport professional by or anything. So I'm a bit more of a generalist.
Yeah. Oh, that's quite interesting actually. Devolution is. I mean, these things all feed. I mean, I'm sure maybe we'll touch on this later, but I presume all these things sort of tentacle across each other, different domains. Alistair.
I'm Alistair Baldwin. I was the senior researcher on this project. My background is in local government and transport policy. I'm going to get the obligatory disclaimer that the views I developed at FG rather than those of my current employer. But my background's in transport policy, planning, business cases, appraisal and valuation type things.
Nice one.
And there's a cat behind me, so that it's definitely video call with me because there will always be cats that appear.
Which cat have we got on camera right now?
So this is Oscar, who was most famous at the Institute of Government for destroying my previous bookcase while I was in their presentation.
Oh well, nice to meet Oscar as well. That's good. So we have three, not two, three guests so far. It sounds like potentially we have other guests that might make cameo appearances later, which is very exciting. Oh, there's a bit of echo. Apparently, how bad is the echo on the? Maybe it's because my ears are close to the microphone. Is that better, everyone? How's that? They'll tell us in the chat. Anyway, right, without further ado, so we are going to be talking about, today this evening we're doing a page turn, which has become somewhat of a Rail Natter staple, which is where we're going to go through this report. So this is the report that you both authored, how governments use evidence to make transport policy. It does what it says on the tin title, and so this isn't the first time I'll be flicking through. Sometimes I do these PDFs, and it's the first time I'm looking at them. But this time, sorry, I'm reading chat about echoes, but I'm not quite sure how to solve the echoes when they. Anyway, right, we'll try and work through the guest echo. I'll try and fix that when we're talking again later. Anyway, I had to flick through this report, and it's fascinating, really interesting, particularly the comparisons between different organisations, between different regions, between different countries, and some very interesting conclusions. And the relationship between transparency, modal splits. It was just a fantastic report, really, really interesting. So basically, I think it's going to be. We've already 5 minutes in, and I think it's echoes to one side. We're gonna crack on. Without further ado, basically, welcome to tonight's Rail Natter. As the Intercity 225 fades away, it's an image of the Institute for Government. Right, let's do this. This is all very fancy technology. Look at this, 3 stacked faces. Right, I'm now going to mute my microphone while you speak because that's to see if that solves the echo problems. first of all, who wants to introduce the Kelly? Do you want to just introduce the Institute for Government to us? Let us know what this organisation is, what they do, and who funds them, and all these sorts of questions you often get asked, I'm sure.
Sure. The Institute for Government, or the IFG, is a think tank working to make government more effective. It's mostly funded by the Gatsby Foundation, which is part of like the Sainsbury load of foundations. Like the majority of the funding comes from there. And it works across just quite a broad range of like government related topics. So like a lot on policy making, which is where this fits in, as well as like on devolution, as I mentioned, on kind of different bits of Whitehall, lots on the civil service and public services, more broadly producing kind of long research papers like this one, as well as kind of short like content for social media, like explainers and blogs, and kind of medium insight papers. It's got about like 35 researchers working there at the moment, I think. And yeah, I think, is it about 10 years old? I should know how old it is. I don't. Maybe just over 10 years.
Okay, that's interesting. So I mean, it covers quite a lot of different policy domains. I mean, there's quite a wide spectrum of different. There's certainly been a few different interesting. I remember there was quite a lot going on during Brexit times. I think there were quite a few different papers being put out. Lots of interesting challenges for government to understand what on earth it was up to at that point. So some interesting stuff getting kicked out. I've fixed the echo, by the way. As everyone in the chat, I just forgotten to mute one of my inputs. It's my fault entirely. So that's the Institute for Government. I think basically it's time to whiz over to the report. So this is it. It's as simple as that. It's the report. I mean, it's about 80-ish pages. We're not going to go through fine-tooth combing each one, but I think what we'll do is I'll go through it as if I'm going to go through this report as if everyone who's in the chat has seen me do this before, but I'm going to go through this as if I'm reading it, picking out things that interest me, but also as guests. Hopefully, you'll see you can see what's on screen. If there's anything that you particularly thought was interesting, or that I've missed that's relevant, or I've said something that's completely load of rubbish, just stop me, pick me up on it, because there's quite a lot to get through, but I think we'll manage it in about an hour. Everyone in the chat is now ticking off. They have bingo on these now. It's got to the point where people have bingo of the catchphrases I use inadvertently because my brain goes into autopilot and repeats things. One of them is, "This is not a professional." This doesn't count for the bingo, by the way. One of them is either sarcastically saying this is professional or saying this is unprofessional. Others are related to, we'll get there. So, without further ado, there's a bit quick intro. That's fine. Just explain the report, and we've got the contents. It's fairly neatly structured. So we go through. So there's a bit of it. So obviously you've got the standard thing of pulling out the summary and the recommendations, but there's an introduction. Then we go through the 5 kind of 4 sections, not including the conclusions. So you start with types of transport policy decisions, which is quite an interesting and useful way kind of thing to have brought out in the abstract. The institutions that commission use evidence, so that's talking about the organisations and the institutions, and then you look at the evidence, and then the people who actually create and apply the evidence. So it feels like quite a neatly split up sort of structure for the report. So I think let's crack on. I'm not going to dwell on the summary because I think unless there's anything particular that you thought was pulled out in the summary that doesn't get kind of picked out later, I think we'll just crack on. Because there's some interesting. There are quite a few interesting points that are worth pulling out if you want to summarize this. But we're going to do that anyway. That's the whole point of this, is that we're going to this whole episode is going to be to summarize this, and maybe we can come back to recommendations later. Actually, any thought? Agreed, Alistair, Kelly. Come back to recommendations later. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, cool. So. Introduction, right? Well, this is it. This is the page turn. The sound issues is all fixed. Everyone's happy. Lovely. Apparently you've already ticked off the professional square. Never mind. So you looked at. So basically, this whole report assesses the UK's use of evidence in transport policy making, and you compared. Was there any particular reason why you chose the 4 other countries? You chose New Zealand, Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands to compare against the UK. Was there a particular reason for that?
Yeah, so there were actually two projects this year that were sort of similar. So we had some colleagues who were working on an international comparison of energy policy, and they just published their kind of final report last week on energy efficiency. And we were sort of looking for countries that had kind of interesting transport systems. So that had some similarities to the UK that were sort of considered well functioning broadly, but that might show some differences. So we picked Sweden because it seemed considered as pretty successful for things like rail and for kind of governance. That we thought Germany was interesting because the kind of federal system was so different to the UK, with so much at a regional level. Netherlands we picked because it turned out to be kind of a lot more interesting when we sort of end up looking into it. We picked it because the stereotypical, well, everyone thinks the Netherlands is excellent at transport policy. Let's see what we can dive into and get. And we picked New Zealand because we were sort of very conscious of a lot of the work they'd done on the living standards framework over there and kind of like non-economic measures in policy making. Although I've got to say, Kelly and I do regret picking New Zealand only because of the 13-hour time difference and trying to schedule interviews with very lovely people at the Ministry of Transport who gave up their evenings that ended up being our early mornings.
Yeah, crikey.
I will also say we did want to do Japan, but no one got back to me at all. I sent so many emails off, and not even we've received this email. So what could have been?
That is very strange because yeah, I mean, there is certainly some cooperation on transport policy between ourselves and Japan. Like the people doing the design for HS2 went over to Japan, but maybe, I don't know, maybe different part of government, and they just weren't interested. That's a shame because that would have been quite an interesting comparison actually. Yeah, Japan being in amongst the mix. Anyway, but these four countries, in terms of, I mean, you might well touch on this later, and forgive me if I'm kind of second guessing, but we can gloss over it if we do. But so those four countries, what are the similarities and differences between those four, kind of more broadly? So not just about transport policy, but in terms of more broadly, just as a bit of context for the viewers. I mean, everyone knows those four countries, but more in terms of the data you've got, things like demographic, population size, urban agglomeration or otherwise, any differences and similarities between the four, more broadly than just transport?
Yeah, I mean, so of them, the Netherlands obviously is very, very dense in terms of its population density, more than the UK, and one of the highest in the world outside the sort of microstates. New Zealand is obviously the reverse, significantly the least dense, much more dispersed population, and Sweden sort of has a slightly interesting geography with it being with elements that are very highly dense and other bits that are a bit more remote. And I think we tried to sort of discuss this a bit later in the report about, well, actually, your palette of policy options aren't really the same wherever you are. New Zealand, it isn't appropriate to build a giant metro that runs everywhere, even if you really like building metros, just because the density isn't there, the population isn't always there to serve it. And the same in the reverse in the Netherlands, you don't always have the space to do other things that you want to do. But yeah, so they're all similar in that sense. They're all very conveniently as well members of the OECD, which means that we could use the very good OECD International Transport Forum data, which is sort of the best attempt to compare their data. So we have a bit of a look here and there through the report at some of the outcomes, and Kelly very artfully did all of the graphical work and doing the comparisons between countries. So that was also a sort of a slight factor, was that it gave us something of a baseline to look at outcomes on.
In terms of like income equality and income inequality, are they sort of the spread of incomes similar-ish to the UK in terms of, like, we have quite wide income inequality, but in terms of the median, is it broadly the same?
So famously, Sweden has very high, relatively low income inequality and very high sort of HDI, Human Development Index, and New Zealand does very well in HDI as well historically. The UK is a bit of an outlier in terms of its sort of level of income inequality. Netherlands, everything is a little more confused because of its status as a low tax place for many corporate activities. So that makes some of the comparisons a little bit more difficult to draw when you're looking at kind of that pure GDP type stuff. But yeah, there are some similarities. Obviously, New Zealand has a more primary industry-based economy in a lot of ways with agricultural exports and stuff like that. But the European countries are not too totally dissimilar.
Yeah. Kelly, was there anything else you picked up when you were drawing the comparisons? As in literally drawing them, not literally and figuratively. Sorry, you did more than draw them. I mean, creating and defining and writing.
Yeah, I should thank our graphics person Melissa actually made them look as pretty as they do now. I didn't make them look like that. I think Alistair's mostly covered that. Not sure what I'd add.
So we've got this. So on this page, you're kind of explaining those, sort of very very broadly explaining the kind of the different the way the different countries work. I think what's interesting is picking out the structure, the differences between that made it interesting as a comparison. You were never going to find a country that was like almost identical to the UK as a comparative. That was never going to work. So yeah, I think these are countries that have lots of similar things going on, but also usefully different systems of well, as we'll see later on with the comparison, with the graphics and the kind of the descriptions of the comparisons, different ways of administering transport policy, which I think is really interesting. Very rapidly we've got the phrase Dutch cycling levels has appeared. I noticed that. Very nice. It's impossible not to, like, everyone has to mind that idea of the Dutch cycling kind of nirvana. So here you're just, by the end of this, you're describing the kind of understanding the different outcomes of transport policy not being simple. And so, for example, you've picked out road safety here in this in Figure 1. So Alistair, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I was going to have a brief shout out for, I mentioned the previous page, the Batuva route. Not everything in Netherlands is great. We would, in a previous version of the report, there was a bit more discussion about this specific kind of rail freight route that got a mention in this month's Modern Railways, actually. I saw. But even countries can be very successful at delivering one kind of infrastructure, it doesn't mean their whole transport policy system is great. The UK, we sort of stay a bit below. The UK has done quite well and tends to do pretty well on road safety for drivers and for passengers. It does less well on cycling and walking, but that doesn't mean it's great. It's kind of great at everything. Road safety is a good example of that. Yeah, because as you say, depending on how you design your infrastructure, we design our infrastructure to be very car safety focused. But that doesn't necessarily mean, particularly in urban areas, that it's very broad user safety focused. So okay, that's a useful kind of comparison to draw out. So then you're in this introduction talking about the importance of using effective evidence in transport policy making, and this is where it jumped out to me as being something that's very interesting. And why this report was so just absolutely captured my attention as soon as I spotted it. To my mind, and we'll see how true this is by the end of this episode. To my mind, the UK has got a lot of very, very good evidence, very good data that we could use. We just don't do a very good job of actually making use of that data in a joined up way. And you don't necessarily have to come in on that, but we'll see how true my assumption was by the end of this. That was my gut feeling. The UK is very, very good at collecting data, as to my mind. Making it open data, we're maybe okay at that. Making it accessible, but we're good at collecting data. We have lots of really good origin destination data, for example, lots of really good data sources, but we don't make use of it. So what you've gone through, you're then explaining why it's useful, why it's a good idea to use evidence to develop transport policy, which might seem like an obvious thing, but actually when I've gone through here, it's quite, you go through these pages, the early part of the report, the introduction, and it's a really good explanation of what data looks like, ways it can be applied. So the different types of evidence here as well. I'm just going to keep going through. Yeah, so kind of that's the introduction really. It's why it's a good idea to use evidence and what that evidence can actually look like. So it's kind of I thought that's kind of quite valuable little input at the start there for anyone reading. So that's the introduction. As I say, cut in on me if you've anything to add, but I'm going to keep hammering forwards. We're already at 20 past. I said time flies on these. Actually, no, I didn't tell you time flies on these things. It's an hour. It flies by. It'll be horribly quick. I'm
We'll probably be at page 22 by the time we get to the end of the hour, but I'll try and hammer forwards. Anyway, right. So, this is one of my favourite sentences in the whole report. In the absence of an overall national strategic direction in the UK or England, there are 3 types of decisions that are made. That for me is like, that's the whole problem. Britain does not have a plan at all. We have no plan. We have no direction, no policy, no overall objective that the DfT has as a catchphrase. It doesn't say, the transport hierarchy is what drives us or anything like that. No, it's just we do transport with a TM at the end. That's pretty much what the DfT does. And so I like that sentence because, but anyway, you end up with lots of these different schemes all vying for attention. So you've listed off these. You've got major infrastructure projects and programs. HS2, RIS2 are the 2 key examples. Smaller infrastructure schemes, so like local road projects, bypasses, new railways, or not new railways, sorry, but like things like new stations, local stations. Things that are funded centrally and allocated centrally, but delivered by local government, which bids for funding, and then individual policies, sort of instrumental policies, things like bus concessionary travel or cutting off petrol and diesel vehicle sales. So these are the 3 things, the 3 kind of types of decision. So I suppose it's worth saying you're framing policy as types of decision. I suppose maybe that is a definition of policy is the framework of decision making. And so these are the 3 different sorts of decisions that are made in terms of transport policy. Is that UK specific there, or is that?
Yes, that's UK specific, and probably maybe even England specific. But that Kelly and I were sort of stretching around to try and work out. Well, actually, okay, how can you try and classify the sorts of decisions that we make in transport policy, particularly in central government, kind of in the UK? And we'll go on to talk about the sort of centralised nature of England, particularly. But that was our sort of best way of splitting it. You have these big things like HS2, like RIS, like Crossrail, that have their own kind of either processes by their own legislation, or they have very specific bespoke things. And you have the kind of like day-to-day project approvals, project funding for sort of smaller projects, and then you have the non-infrastructure stuff, which is your sort of policies about concessionary travel or ticketing or things like that. That's sort of a MISC section.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I see that you say it's basically England, because I suppose you see a slightly different approach emerging in the devolved nations. So Wales has a kind of an interesting relationship with transport devolution in that they've got quite a lot of the power, but they haven't got any of the funding capability, or haven't got much of the funding capability. Scotland, it's a bit of a clearer picture in that Scotland has essentially entirely an autonomous set of transport policy delivery. And correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but to my mind, it's entirely devolved. They have funding powers. They have. And that means that in Scotland it's not as down in this part of the world. I am a Scot, but I live down here in York. It can look quite rosy over the border, but actually they have similar challenges of actually a lack of direction, a lot of investment in roads, contrary to headline policy statements. There's sort of some of the same challenges actually that we see in Westminster, really. So it's not quite a perfect rosy picture, but with things like railway electrification, there is a bit more of a broad look at strategy, and some of those things do drive in a way that perhaps doesn't happen in England. So it's interesting.
I think we'd say what we found was that the reference to England is the only country which doesn't have a kind of national strategy. So the Scottish transport strategy. There's a new Welsh one as of last year. Northern Ireland one is pretty long.
They're working on a new one in Northern Ireland, but I mean resources are just are so strapped there that I think that's a bit of a struggle. So I think Northern Ireland's a bit of an aside there, but both Wales and Scotland definitely both have new-ish transport strategies and kind of delivery programs for them.
So Northern Ireland, it's worth, I glossed over, I kind of didn't even mention Northern Ireland, which is bad of me. I always slap myself on the wrist when I do that. I always try and refer to GB, not UK, because the railway being somewhat of a self-contained thing, it's easy to, anyway, waffle. Northern Ireland, what is the structure? Is transport entirely devolved, both funding and, is it? It's
nearly entirely devolved. There are always the kind of odd like licensing things or that aren't.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's even more extensive than Scotland, especially because it's just so separate.
Yeah. It's entirely. I mean, it would make fundamentally it is entirely. Unless Boris gets his tunnel magically anytime in the next 10 years, it is an entirely self-contained sort of transport, connected with the rest of the island of Ireland. Yeah, okay, so that, and it's, what, as an aside for anyone, I often, but people point out, look at people do the correlation, not causation thing, and they say, look at how wonderful railways have been under privatisation, look how much the passenger ridership has increased, and then if you just overlay the Northern Ireland figures, it's pretty much the same rise in sort of ridership in Northern Ireland, despite the fact that it's been nationalised there the whole time, or rather state operated in a very different way to the structure in the UK. It's Northern Ireland is interesting, kind of with some of the same pressures that the rest of the UK, but it's entirely self-contained transport system. It's a useful sort of thing to kind of microcosm to compare the GB versus Northern Ireland on that. Anyway, right, I digress, as often I do. So that's kind of, so you split this off into the three different types of decision making, and you sort of elaborated on that, I presume. So that's really that's part one, which is just a quick introduction into the types of transport policy decisions, which is fairly straightforward. So then things start getting more detailed, right? At this point, we're looking at the institutions that commission and use this evidence that we've talked about, and so we're starting with the UK. So this isn't just a UK specific section. This is where we've got our nice graphics. So we start with the UK. And so this is talking about, so this is really the crux of it. The UK government in Westminster develops the policy, provides the bulk of funding, covering rail, strategic highways, yada yada. So you've picked out that Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have got that substantially devolved policy. So you kind of talk a little bit about that. Yeah, okay, so here, so you've talked about the fact the most comprehensive plan of the devolved administrations is the Scottish one. So that's a 20-year horizon, which is interesting. Wales, so Wales are, you can see that there's, you sort of talk about the others as well, to a lesser extent. This last paragraph here talks about the challenge of the devolved nations, particularly when it comes to things like roads and railways, is that they don't just stop at the border. These things are like continuous. And also, even if a railway is even if a bit of infrastructure is entirely within the Scottish border, I've been having a conversation with Professor Mark Berry about this today, as often we do, lock horns over this. You cannot extricate the fact that almost every regional railway service in Wales passes through England, and indeed passes through some of the most congested bottlenecks in England. And that's true for roads as well. So it's not just rail policy, but actually for any kind of medium and long distance transport and freight, you cannot really separate those networks out. So North Wales relies on Crewe, relies on sort of Merseyside, and then stuff coming down to the south, and indeed anything that's going from North Wales to South Wales relies on either Crewe, Manchester, or other parts of the network, or Birmingham even. So that's quite interesting. So it's so that you kind of talk about how that implies how that influences the way the organisations talk about policy. So what I'm going to do is shove the infographic up, and then we can just talk about it for a bit. That's probably the most sensible thing to do. Who wants to talk, Kelly or Alistair? Who wants to pick it up and talk about this entire graphic?
I'll give it a go. So Kelly produced an excellent version of these for each of our countries that was then designed up by our comms team. So what we were trying to do was capture on one page the kind of most relevant sort of organisations for transport evidence, but also facts about the country and the kind of transport outcomes in terms of their kind of modal split. And we haven't captured everything. I think we say somewhere else in here that we counted at least 20 different organisations within the kind of DFT family that have some kind of evidence role. There's other things that aren't on there, like the Transport Research Laboratory kind of isn't on there, which is sort of a quasi non-governmental sort of organisation. So we were trying to kind of capture everything, but I think what we sort of can see from this one is that the DFT is kind of really at the heart of everything. It's our second one of our larger ministries, and it has the biggest sort of set of responsibilities of any of our ministries in terms of kind of what it gets involved in. And then obviously it has the control over the Highways England and Network Rail, the kind of on the delivery arm.
And just for anyone who's not sure, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, FTE is full-time employee, right?
Yes.
So giving it a proxy for organisational size, right?
Yeah. So you've not lived until you've tried to go through the civil service statistics for other countries to work out how many people worked at minor government agencies. That's all I can say.
So really, it's that huge amount of centralisation. Okay, part of the DVSA and the DVLA at the moment, because they've got a lot of clerical staff, hence the numbers are larger, I kind of guess. But the DFT, the Department for Transport is just, the scale is, it's 3,000 full-time employees essentially. You compare that to 12 what's that, 12 members in the BTP of the Transport Authority. Okay, that's related to the number of authorities.
Yeah, that's the number of authorities. Okay. But I mean, so it's very big, and I think it's not quite the size. I think it's just the level of policy responsibility and the level of decision-making responsibility, particularly. So there are other sort of agencies that we talk about in other countries that are maybe bigger. I think the Rijkswaterstaat in Netherlands is bigger than that, but the number of decisions that are taken by DFT that relate to UK transport policy are much bigger than any of our other countries.
So you've got a bit of a hierarchy there. So you've got sort of the DFT at the centre, then you've got the key agencies and public bodies. So those are the arm's length. So I suppose Crossrail would be, as an example, would be in there as well. As a sort of an organisation, our arm's length body like HS2. Where does Highways England... Oh, yeah, Highways England, sorry. So then outside of that, then you have the state-owned enterprises like Network Rail, like the DFT's operator of last resort, like Highways England. So you've got this... And then the university... And then on the other side, but sort of a similar level of... You've got research bodies like universities and sort of some of the other organisations. So very centralised. The DFT at the core... And as you say, holding the levers of decision making, even if they don't have even though they don't have necessarily the same numbers as some of the other centralised organisations in other countries. Okay, and that certainly is reflected in some of the feeling within the transport industry. Is that the DFT, certainly within railways, the DFT has a huge amount of control. For a while, we had the Strategic Rail Authority that had some control, but that was levered away. That was when it was wrapped up. All of that went back to the DFT. And one of the consequences of the structure of the railway, as an example, it's not quite to the same extent for roads, but the railways are incredibly fragmented, which means that you have to have lots of people writing rules to make sure that all those fragmented bits talk to each other. And that inevitably results in centralisation, strangely enough. It ends up resulting in more government control or more state control. Yeah, okay. Anything else? And the modal split is interesting. So these modal split figures, what are these in relation to? Because they're slightly different to the modal shares. I suppose these are passenger journeys, so it's not related to freight. And it's an indicator. Yeah. So is there anything you want to say about the modal split, just to sort of talk about how that's derived?
Kelly, anything?
I realise I think it is just for England as well, right? I think that's not sure whether that's clear.
Okay.
I can't actually. Sorry, this has only just come up, but I can't actually see the screen you're sharing.
Oh, really?
Not right now. Okay.
So at the moment, I have page 18 up. So if you've got the PDF report in front of you, I've got page 18 up.
Sorry. It's just if it's grid view, it cuts off.
Okay. Right. Yes, that's fine. So I just basically there's modal split of about 60% for car versus 2 and 5% for train and bus, and then 26% for walking, 2% for cycling. So if there's anything, it's just whether it says IFG analysis rather than DFT figures, which is why I kind of was curious.
That's just our analysis of the National Travel Survey, so that's what we use, and that's why it's just England, because there is not a comparable NTS equivalent for the devolved nations.
Which is kind of annoying. Yeah, I've come across that problem before when I've been trying to kind of pull things together. It's slightly frustrating. I end up using the DFT modal share stats, which are much more broad brush and not particularly, and they include for all journeys, so they include freight as well, which perhaps isn't as useful. Right, so that's that one. Is it worth jumping to the other countries, or do you think, to look at the other countries' sections, or do you think there are some things to pull out of there that we haven't talked about already? I think we've kind of talked about centralised responsibility and some of the problems. So you talk about some of the challenges here, which is interesting. Yeah. So anything you want to pull out before we jump to the next country?
I say it's not all bad. It's so
Okay,
having centralisation does allow you to have a kind of critical mass of people who are involved. So our sort of whole perspective throughout this whole thing is with sort of evidence, looking at kind of evidence use and analysis. If you are centralising everything and you are a relatively big country, it gives you enough people who are working on it to have kind of deep, capable expertise in the civil service. If you have a much smaller civil service that doesn't do anything to do with evidence, it's more difficult, and we saw that in a couple of our other countries. And theoretically as well, it might allow you to transfer that evidence more easily into policy if people are kind of both physically proximate, although maybe not currently, but in terms of like organisationally proximate as well. And there's sort of more movement between those kind of teams. But yeah, there's all sorts of problems that come with it as well.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, it's nebulous to understand. There are so many. I mean, this is what the challenge of a paper like this is, that there's so much that you could pick, and like any research project, like you could go off down avenues and sort of do case studies and all sorts of kind of detail, but actually trying to keep, you'd end up doing it for 20 years, right? There's so much going on that particularly as the world of transport policy is quite mobile at the moment, shall we say. I suppose. Yeah, so it's, in fact, was that for both of you, actually, maybe Kelly, was that a challenge for this? Was it a challenge to kind of keep at a certain level of detail and keep consistent on that without disappearing down rabbit holes? Did you find that a challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the report, the way we were kind of structuring the report changed quite a few times in the process of writing it. The IFG especially likes to kind of, they're saying every paragraph having an argument to it, whereas I think Alistair and I both had a tendency to think, oh, this is really interesting, let's explore it more. And that was particularly difficult with, like, I found with all of the country comparators, where there's just a temptation to kind of explain it more than kind of put it forward any argument. And there were so many interesting case studies. As we said, there was a whole large box on the Batu-Verite route. Because we got into reading about that and it was fascinating. It did, the report was already growing so long that we did need to be quite brutal with cutting it down and focusing on trying to pull out the kind of higher level arguments a lot of the time, backing it up with detail where we could, but narrowing down some of the focus.
So is that common across all of the policy domains, or did you find that this transport report was kind of particularly bad for having kind of interesting rabbit holes to disappear off down?
So from my experience, this transport report was the worst for that, in that it was just it was such a broad topic. A lot of the reports I've worked on otherwise, for example, I did a report on the Sewell Convention. That's got its own narrow focus, whereas the use of evidence in transport policy
it's pretty
it's huge. So we had this focus on, for example, institutions and analysis and things, just to give it quite that strong framework to go in. But there was definitely a lot more scope for rabbit holes.
So what I'll do is, unless you catch me on anything, we'll whiz forwards to, because there's a lot of detail. I think it's worth, conscious of time. There's a few things about the different organisations, scrutiny of evidence. So particularly pull out the fact that the scrutiny of evidence is inadequate. And I think we'll look at these when it comes to recommendations. We'll maybe pick out some of the kind of the detail. But there's basically for people on here watching. Hello, all of you watching. This report, it's very clearly written. So there's nothing inaccessible in here. So, particularly these sections, it's interesting that I'm not a huge fan of the National Infrastructure Commission, and it was interesting to read your words about the NIC and what their relationship is. They're a body of the Treasury, but they kind of work in opposition to...
I think it's fair to say we're more positive than NIC than you are, but that it might be a low bar to clear. So it's better. The IFG has written reports. There's a whole set of reports in 2018 that wrote on infrastructure that are really pretty good. And I sort of recommend that are focused on infrastructure delivery as well as sort of evidence. But one of the things we discussed in there is that, or my predecessors did, is that the NIC should be, I think, an executive non-departmental public body, which so it should move. It shouldn't have that tie to the Treasury, even if they're independent. They are independent, but it's not. Nothing is ever perfect. I would say.
Very diplomatically put. I think I get a bit more red-faced in my descriptions of the NIC. The thing is, theoretically, the NIC would be, to my mind, would be a really good thing, because they pull together policy and strategic direction but they don't. They kind of anyway. Yeah, but that's for another discussion. I've said quite enough about the NSA, but no, that's an interesting perspective. So, scrutiny of evidence. We'll come back to that. Right, we're going to do the overseas comparisons because it's already 20 to. This is what it's 20 to 8 already. Right, let's get our let's go and have some waffles in the Netherlands. I said I wasn't going to do stereotypes. Although all I can think about now is actually having some delicious waffles in the Netherlands. Anyway, right, I digress. The Netherlands. Tell us about what you found when you looked at the data for the Netherlands.
The data or more generally?
Or more generally. Both. So either or. If you want to start with a broad brush maybe and then kind of drill down onto what you kind of some of the interesting things you looked at in terms of data.
Sure. So, I mean, for broad brush, I think the Netherlands, the thing that we found most interesting about it was their use of research institutes. I think that so they have kind of the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, PBL, the Council for the Environment and Infrastructure, RLI, and another plan bureau, which is CPB, which kind of works in the area as well. And in the UK, we don't currently have a kind of publicly funded research institute, so I think that was to see a country which made such like great use of those was a really interesting comparison. And so we talked a lot with kind of representatives from those research institutes about what they thought, how independent they were, how they like the effect that had, the evidence that they could produce. Generally, they had like formal relationships with the department's fixed budgets, but then quite a lot of freedom over especially their methods, and then could start a lot of their work on their own initiative as well.
Interesting. Okay,
yeah. So yeah, that was really interesting. And I think although we did find that there had been like kind of increasingly sidelined in the past 10 years, in favor of like consultancies that could work a bit more quickly. I think, generally with the, it was very interesting to kind of see that contrast to the UK's in terms of where they look for evidence primarily. I think that was probably the main thing from Netherlands. Alistair, do you have anything on this?
I would say the other thing is the kind of not just that those institutions exist, but they tend to have quite a lot of longevity. The two plan bureaus are post Second World War, and have been, in the Netherlands policy space for decades, and they obviously have very long running planning for regional governance, regional infrastructure, famous for sort of transport first planning, places like Almere and places like that. So that was the other sort of contrast we found to the UK. We have a tendency in the UK to sort of chop and change institutions when we get bored of them. The rail industry, not rail industry, but like the rail sector, this happens quite a bit. Whereas some of our other countries had stuff that had been going on a lot longer, and that helped for policy stability, and people kind of knew where they stood and knew what the relationships were.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose that role is, much as it'd be nice if it was undertaken by universities, okay, there's some university research, but actually that role is entirely undertaken by the big four kind of consultancies, right? Like basically in the UK, it's almost entirely done by the big kind of pure consultancies, right?
It does depend a lot on what kind of research it is. So if you go and my sort of interest is particularly kind of economic research and stuff to do with transport appraisal and analysis, and a lot of that is done by a relatively small number of academics and a relatively small number of institutions, UCL, ITS Leeds, UE in Bristol, Imperial, and they do a lot of it, and it's less the big four who do get quite heavily involved in kind of rail contracty stuff, but it's more the big consultancies. It's your ACOMs, WSPs, Jacobs, etc. do fair bits of the research as well.
Okay, so some of that spatial planning, so the early stuff before it starts becoming modally specific, it is actually some of the engineering consultancies. Even though it's kind of perhaps the pure consultants doing that work, it is the ACOMs and the Jacobs. That is interesting. Okay. Yeah, and as you say, there's a hugely diverse amount of research there, so it's being done by a wide range. But I think that longevity of an institution existing that's a very interesting takeaway. That's a really interesting takeaway. Anything else about the Dutch before we whiz on? I've noticed that they've got a 20-year long-term plan, which for me that doesn't feel like that much of a horizon. But is it rolling? So does it continue to move on every year, or does it How do they update that?
Yeah, so that's the MIRT, and that kind of gets updated every 2 years, I think. So it gets changed. So other countries have a similar sort of approach. Sweden has a similar kind of approach when we'll get there.
Okay, yeah. Okay, right. Let's jump forward to Sweden as described. They have the national transport plan in relation to that, so that's good.
Yes.
Yeah. So Kelly, anything that you want to tell us about Sweden?
I think Alistair is probably best for Sweden.
Yeah, sure.
Local Sweden expert, man who's never been to Sweden. And so the interesting thing about Sweden is their ministry is really tiny. So 50 people who work on transport, but they have very large kind of semi-independent civil service agencies. And I'm not sufficiently familiar with Sweden's sort of constitutional background, but that is not uncommon. That is kind of across all policy areas. So, but what you have there, the kind of interesting thing is much more things are public, and we sort of discuss this a bit later. We talk about scrutiny, but it's more common to talk about for sort of directions to be given to Trafikverket, who are the kind of like the nearest proxy to bits of DFT that we're interested in here, to say, we are asking you to provide advice on a national transport plan for the next 15 years, and Trafikverket will respond and will publish that advice, in a sort of formal way back to the ministry. I think that we found that pretty interesting. The other thing is they've got this thing called K2, which is kind of quite unusual. It's a sort of international public transport research centre that's a kind of funded by a mixture of their innovation agency and central government and kind of regional government as well, that does kind of lots of interesting things on just public transport research as well. So we found that sort of a particularly kind of interesting thing about Sweden. And the sort of final thing is that we found, or certainly we were told, there's a lot more permeability. So it's more common for people to go between local, regional government, academia, and central government. So we spoke to somebody who had started their career in local government, moved to academia, then moved to central government, as all in quite senior roles. And I can't really think of anyone in the UK having a career sort of trajectory like that one. So that was quite interesting as a way of getting ideas sort of to and from academia and stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Which is something that, okay. Maybe we'll touch on that in the recommendations. But that again feels like the lack of movement of people across different backgrounds between industry, research bodies, and policy making. That doesn't feel like there is a huge amount of flow there. That is interesting. Okay, so that was Sweden. We're now going to skip up to. We're going to take a trip around the entire planet and many time zones and find our way over to New Zealand. Who wants to talk about New Zealand? All the numbers are quite a bit smaller.
So I think, just the main thing is just how empty this infographic was. In all the rest of them, I was trying to cram everything on, and then this one, I was just like, well, just a lot of empty pink bits here. Their central ministry is just tiny. It's, I think, 163 full-time equivalent. And I think that kind of that small size gives them kind of a little bit more ability to be kind of innovative and to work closely with the other ministries. I think they had the best probably interdepartmental working out of, or at least one of the best out of it was very good, especially compared to the UK there. And I think that's enabled by kind of their small size. But like the impression we also got was that it was pretty chaotic there. They have such a short electoral time span and everything. They've got a short the government policy statements, their transport strategy equivalent, and it just felt like everything was a bit of a mad rush, and that they had these kind of great ideas about the evidence that they wanted to be using, and then just no time to get it or to actually use it.
Is that a bit of like inertia? Because I suppose is that the fact they're so small, it can be chaotic, and that if you've got a large organisation, it's a bit more treacly, it's a bit more difficult for it to have lots of crazy. Is that sort of what you sort of pulled out from that? It's almost like the size of an organisation, the size of the DFT means that it can't be quite as chaotic and lots of things happening. Or did you find it was more political cycle driven?
So I think I think probably both, but I think, definitely the size of it there helps in that. So they had an issue with, I think it was embezzlement, that meant that a load of their like there was a clear out of senior employees and a lot of turnover very quickly. And I think that kind of thing completely then changed the atmosphere and the overriding ideas within the department in a way that you can't imagine. Yeah, I mean, you can't imagine kind of as much of a clear out of kind of senior employees happening on something, say, as big as the DFT and that having any kind of similar impact. So I think probably both there. I think the other main thing, one of the main things we picked up from New Zealand is, again, that they do not have any kind of publicly funded research bodies there again. And so they didn't tend to turn to like academics from New Zealand. Like in the UK, we don't have the publicly funded research body, but there are these good links with the universities and a strong UK like transport academic sector. And there wasn't, or at least the perception is that there isn't the same in New Zealand. And so, they were turning a lot to transport academics from the UK. We did hear potentially that there were some biases there about kind of, it's good to get in transport academics from Oxford, and that potentially that's why they weren't turning as much to some of the centres in New Zealand. But it did, so, perhaps they're not fostering the same community there by ignoring it a bit. So that was probably the main things we pulled out from New Zealand. But I really, really enjoyed the sections on New Zealand.
Oh, good. Yeah, working. I mean, time zones to one side. I've never done any work in New Zealand. My time zones are always like either 5 hours ahead with India or 5 hours behind with like the Eastern Seaboard. So I've never had to deal with like, what is it, like 30?
13, I think.
13 hours. Yeah. It's a bit trickier, but it's interesting. I've got some friends over in New Zealand, and all I have in my head is that the radical difference between the two islands is that like there's quite substantial differences, and that has policy implications. But I suppose clusters of fairly built up area and then huge areas with nothing.
I think as well the interesting thing is that not just academics from the UK, but people we spoke, quite a high proportion of people we spoke to in the ministry had worked in the UK or were from the UK. I think there is quite a lot of kind of cross pollination in terms of, I think people from the UK have emigrated to New Zealand, or people from New Zealand have worked in the UK for a few years and in transport and gone back.
That is interesting, but I think key takeaway is that and the innovation you talked about, Kelly, is quite interesting. I think maybe we'll touch on that shortly. That was a particularly interesting point. So over to Deutschland, we're heading over to Germany, back in Europe again. Who wants to take on Germany and tell us the summary of Germany?
I'll give it a go. So this is actually one of the radically simplified ones, because the German ministry, the BMVI, has got like 43 sub things. So this is relatively simple. So there are a couple. It is a central ministry that is quite powerful for the things that it does, which are road and rail and kind of federal road and rail. But things like airports and ports and other bits and pieces are within the domain of the Länder and the regions, and that's, I guess, probably our other main takeaway here is the kind of much greater increase in regional participation in policy making. Not just, there are things that are regional policies, but some national policies have greater regional input than we would expect in the UK. I think we were looking at drone policy, they formed a kind of regional board to help with it, and because some of the regions had differing opinions about whether they wanted to regulate drones, which is kind of crazy if you think about it in the UK. Like, if you try and put it in our context, it's like Hampshire and Surrey having radically different ideas about drones. It doesn't really fit within our frame of reference for what we think local areas and regions do.
Yeah, that's like fundamentally deep-rooted thing in the UK is our, or certainly in GB, is our innate acceptance of an entirely centralized approach to policy and thought like that. It's it's the sort of thing that Tom Forth talks a lot about devolution. I'm sure. Yeah, you're both nodding. Yeah, Tom
wrote a very long thread about this report. So
it was good actually. Yeah, it was. Tom and I, we intersect, and sometimes we think exactly the same thing, and sometimes we differ, particularly on things like devolution. But increasingly, I'm finding myself agreeing with him in devolution terms, given politics at the moment. But it's interesting that devolution. So the things that he talked, the reason I mentioned Tom is because he puts up lots of different case studies of different examples of things where devolution influences policy. And Ashley, Kelly, I dare say I'll be looking forward to the next report that you put out on devolution, because it's interesting to see how that not just how that influences policy, but how ideas about devolution influence policy. Not just devolution itself, but the idea of where policy should be being made that's quite interesting. Anyway, that's for next time, I think. If ever you'll come back on. Right, so, okay, anything else on Germany? I mean, it's a huge country and there's a lot to say.
I think I've, in the interest of time, I would not blather about German research bodies for a while, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, so basically, in terms of structure, it's centralized to the...
Centralized, mostly modal structure of the kind of central ministry. We were sort of most interested in their kind of federal transport investment plan, which is about 10 to 15 years. Most recent one was 2015. That allocates most of the kind of big road and rail investment in Germany.
Okay, yeah. So those were the organisations, and then what you do in the report is you picked out sort of key areas. So you talked about research institutes across the different, so kind of themes about the different research institutes. You talk about local and regional government. So this is to do with constitutional arrangements and sort of devolution, right? This section's talking about devolution and how that influences the differences, particularly in, so kind of picking out these. It's kind of what we've talked about already. So I'm whizzing through this partly because we've got 3 minutes until 8 p.m. And with 31 pages through. I said 23. I wasn't actually that far off, uncomfortably. It's because all the fun stuff happened at this point, right? We'll go through. We'll get to recommendations and everything will speed up theoretically. So then talking about size and the sizes of different organisations and how that influences how effectively they use evidence. Essentially, so I'm going to kind of blast through this. So then and I think I'll blast through section 3 as well, because I think it's the conclusions where it'll give you a chance to sort of explain and talk about what we've gone through. But it's kind of going through...
devastating critique of me going on about tag for 15 pages at a time. It's a niche habit. Don't worry. So, it all comes through. It comes through in our conclusions.
Yeah, nice one. So the analysis of evidence is where you kind of talk about. So you go into detail about the UK's some detail about the UK's approach. This is a key line for me was the fact that there's this huge weight on benefit cost ratios, and it dominates the phrase dominating thinking. You said that lots of your interviewees picked that out. I think that certainly matches my understanding. Is that there is an almost meaningless focus on benefit cost ratio to the point where people are forgetting what the whole point of the infrastructure underneath it is for, which can only be a bad thing. So there's some talk about value for money guidance acting to remove. So there's it's not that is an entirely purposeless system. It's just that there's benefit cost ratios and so this is your section on tag. So there's lots on BCR, and it's worth everyone, if people want the detail, dive into it. It's good. Decision making concentrating on a narrow range of scenarios, that I think is a really common familiar thread as well. So looking at kind of narrow ranges of forecasting, traffic forecasting, for example.
The only thing I'd pull out there is the fact that some of that is sort of driven legally, in the sense, in the way that there's some kind of uncertainty. People don't want to express uncertainty or look at a really diverse range of scenarios when you're entering into these quite complicated legal processes about NSIPs and development consent orders and Transport and Works Act orders, and you're going to public inquiry. And you don't want to be standing in front of a planning inspector and saying, well, actually, in 3 out of 7 scenarios that we've run it through, there's no point building this scheme.
Yeah.
That incentivizes people to go really narrow, and I think that produces less good schemes. Phil Goodwin has a really good point, which is that we should do the most and least positive forecast for everything. So you should have a scheme, and you should have the most negative and the most positive, and that will give you a better idea of making more resilient schemes. That's all I'd say on that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, and I suppose. And maybe we'll pick up on this later, but that it feels like there is that we are overburdened with legislation, and the legislation is there to make sure that the decisions being made at a strategic level and below are are being made in a way that's publicly accountable, right? That's the purpose of that. It's for public accountability. But do you touch on, maybe you touch on it later, whether whether Transport Works Act orders and that level of rigor to the point where people are afraid to say the wrong thing, is that, that doesn't feel productive to me. It feels like there are better ways to do that. Maybe we'll touch on that later.
Yeah, it gets very complicated, and I'm not a lawyer, but yeah. I think that it is challenging to reconcile with the sort of legal structures that we have, and that people have very valid concerns about property rights or environmental impacts of things that are sort of legislated through inquiries. So there are some difficulties there. It'll be really interesting to see what comes out of the DfT's Project Speed, and stuff like that. And they've said in the National Infrastructure Strategy there will be some revisions to the NSIP process. So it will be interesting to see if anything kind of comes to try and say, well, actually, should we look at this in a different way?
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, and the duplication of process, like as has been talked about, and this is something that was picked up by the Scottish Greens actually in their rail policy report, is the duplication of processes between subgroups of that answer to, for example, DfT or Transport Scotland, and then the DfT or Transport Scotland themselves, almost duplicating those processes within STAG or WebTag. So Network Rail's GRIP process. Which is basically, if you drew out any project management process, it would look like GRIP. Like those 8 breakdowns are basically any project management process, but within that, the stage gates, some of the hoops that you have to jump through are very similar or indeed identical to ones that you have to do through WebTag, and that feels like, but you're having to do them as an elongated Gantt chart the whole way through. So, it's some interesting things to pick out there. We're mashing our way through 8 p.m. I'm so sorry, everyone. Actually, I'm sorry to our guests. Everyone on here in the chat's loving it, so no sympathy to you in the chat. But guests, apologies. So, transport models are important, but their limits are not well understood. That's very interesting. So and this comes to transport. I think if we pick this up in the conclusion, that'd be good, because I think the way that transport models feed into this is related to transparency. So I think that'll be interesting to pull out. And then you're picking out some of the other issues that your interviewees have picked out, which is interesting as well. So, commercial sensitivities and capabilities, constraining scrutiny or rather, actually, it's better for me to phrase it exactly as you've written it. Modelling scrutiny being too constrained by commercial sensitivities and capabilities. Assumptions and limitations being poorly understood by decision makers. Perverse incentives. These are all things that feel familiar to me as someone who writes about transport policy. These are all things that feel very, very vividly familiar as problems and challenges. Political vision and decision-making don't always align with objective transport appraisal, yet that's certainly true. So things like carbon emissions are kind of a key example of where that feels connected. And pacers, yeah. Get rid of pacers, but pacers don't disappear. That sort of thing. Yeah, there are. Oh, you literally do mention pacers.
Yeah.
Alistair, you're both nerds. Both of you are equally nerds for allowing that to remain in the report.
Fascinating
Kelly, you're not getting
ministerial direction.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's yeah, this was quite something. Literally, oh dear. Yeah.
So essentially, there was no way to make the economics stack up because they're fully depreciated, really cheap to run. So, and I'm sure DfT tried very hard, but it just ran into this politics problem because politics versus economics, and you had the ministerial direction saying, "I'm aware that it's a poor BCR to replace them." But I'm telling you, I'm instructing you to. That's a classic example of politics versus what we think of as objective, analytical, evidence-led decisions.
Yeah, and the reality is, a benefit. All BCRs are subject to the same forces. Whether those, to a lesser or greater extent, but they are all subject to those forces. So, getting too fixated on BCRs at the expense of being honest. This is why it's so important to have policy direction, right? Because if you don't have adequate policy direction, that objectivity and subjectivity, that grey area, you can't hold anyone to account if you don't know what the overall high-level objectives are. There's nothing to hold those ultimately subjective decisions accountable, which is kind of what you're pushing on here. I think you pull on later on. Here we are. Yep, some more of these. Another example. Yeah, basically, I'm enjoying this because it poo-poos BCRs. In isolation. It's not saying BCR should be got rid of and never looked at again, but context is really key. I think you pull that out really well. At least that's my interpretation anyway. I admit I hate BCRs because they're put on a pedestal and treated as sacrosanct rather than thinking about the wider strategic objectives. Yeah, transparency. So here's a key thing: transparency and lack of transparency in transfer decisions. And one example, and I don't just HS2 isn't what I spend all my time rabbiting on about, but it's a good example of where the perceived lack of transparency. Actually, HS2 has been more transparent, I think, than a lot of projects. But the trouble is, it's so big. There's such a body of evidence. People find it inaccessible, which basically amounts to the same thing. That is essentially still not transparent, even if they're being more open. And that leads to people thinking there's a conspiracy. It leads to people thinking, well, this big project that's happening, I don't get what it's for. Why is it appearing? And as much that, and then people talk about, do the existing railway. Well, the lack of transparency about what's happening and the decisions being made about the existing railway further feed into that feeling of lack of transparency in transport, and it's sort of a disvirtuous cycle. So, not publishing information leads to more criticism. This is all very, very familiar. There are lots of things here. We're already hammering through time. Like rationale for different forms of analysis. Open data. There's some stuff about open data, which is really good. I was glad you picked out open data. But evaluation being fragmented and inconsistent, and research priorities not being clear. So lots of very interesting there's a huge amount of very interesting stuff. And so before I move into the next section, which is kind of looking at the overseas comparators, which I'm actually going to whiz through because I think those comparators at the end will, conscious of time.
What I say is they're actually mostly quite similar. That's one of the things. There's a DFT International Appraisal comparison about 8 years ago that Tom Worsley and Pete Mackey did, and we did something vaguely similar here. And actually, they all tend to use CBA in some way. New Zealand does a lot more interesting stuff about living standards and having stuff that works for both a living standards way and a traditional CBA way. That's kind of the most interesting thing. But actually, if you look at it, they all use some form of benefit cost ratio.
I think
sorry, go on, Kelly.
All of them, apart from New Zealand, also mentioned kind of putting too much emphasis on that. I think several I know someone in the Netherlands was like, I think we're the most fond of numbers. And I was like, I think our other interviewees will disagree. But yeah, it was definitely much. Everyone kind of echoed that over reliance.
Interesting. That is very interesting. Yeah. So I think we'll pick up some of this in the conclusions. I think the key thing is that there's a lot of very useful information to kind of pull out of there if anyone wants to flick through and kind of pull in some of the information there. I think just really the interviewees, there's just really valuable information coming out from and it's interesting that all the people you spoke to, some of these things, and it's what you'd expect, I suppose. But I suppose it's just kind of interesting and reassuring to see some of these themes coming out really, really obviously. Was there anything that surprised you in terms of when you were speaking to interviewees, or kind of trends that you hadn't expected going into this, or kind of responses perhaps or kind of multiple different people saying the same thing that you didn't expect, or did you very much go into this with an open mind and just open ears?
I think I came into it with knowing a fair bit about DFT appraisal. I was surprised that everyone in every country said numbers are really important, we all do CBA. And then if you actually look at the evidence on terms of what projects get approved in other countries, all of our comparator countries have some sort of research about it, it doesn't actually correlate very well. So certainly there's research in Germany, Netherlands and Sweden and elsewhere that actually has a pretty weak correlation. So everyone says it's fantastically important, but then it doesn't relate brilliantly to what gets built, which is kind of odd. But in the UK, you can't actually work that out because the data isn't there to understand whether it does correlate well or not. Interesting.
So right, this section 4. Now, I'm a big fan of skills and people, and I think fundamentally the people involved in an organisation at any level of policy or implementation or whatever it is are absolutely critical. However, having said that, because of time, I think I'm going to whiz through this section incredibly quickly, so to entirely contradict my own personal feelings on how important people are. But is there anything in this section that you think is worth kind of putting front and centre that isn't in the conclusions and recommendations?
Just DFT suffers less from rapid turnover than some of the other departments. So IFG's written other reports identifying the problems of rapid turnover in civil service. DFT is relatively stable.
Interesting. Because that's a kind of a standard stereotype within the industry looking at DFT. The stereotype is that there's a lot of churn. But it's interesting
so it could be much worse. Is what I'm saying.
That's interesting. Yeah. Kelly, is there anything that you in this section particularly that you found interesting or
I think comparatively, again, New Zealand, very high turnover, contributing to the kind of chaotic nature.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting as well how research institutes that we mentioned before with bit more longevity also play a role in supporting institutional memory, often being able to fill in the gaps that the departments themselves are not so sure about. Which obviously institutional memory is a big problem in the UK as well. We did hear about that at DFT, despite the kind of a bit more stability. That's probably what I'll draw out.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, that's okay. That's very interesting. The two kind of quite interesting. So, and I suppose that'll get pulled out in these in the conclusions. So, without further ado, we're not doing too badly. I'm so sorry, folks. Well, actually, you two. I'm so sorry, both of you two. 10 minutes overdue. I think we've got it's 11 minutes past 8. If I stop saying 11 minutes past 8, describing the time, we'll be able to crack on. The conclusions. I suppose I could go through these, but actually, do either of you want to go through and kind of chat about some of them? I suppose, maybe, yeah, in terms of the UK, so this is all comparing to the UK, and then you kind of look at what we could learn from overseas and some conclusions on that. And there are some common themes throughout these, and I pick out two of the most interesting ones after we finish going through the PDF. But so the UK has strengths, and it is worth picking those out because we can learn from as much from our strengths as from our weaknesses. So kind of, yeah, do either of you want to talk about those strengths that the UK has in our approach?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a bit more sympathetic to TAG and BCRs than you are, I think. I'm not going to say I have a great affinity for it, but like there are good things about that. It's pretty stable. It's been long lasting. There's a lot of expertise about it. It allows you to compare relatively diverse sort of types of projects and theoretically prioritize funding. I think that's pretty good. I think that our main thing is above what you might go into is that stuff crossing departments can be pretty poor. There are some areas where it's good. It's zero emission vehicles is good. The joint unit is quite successful, but the classic housing and transport problem. If we had about 3 more years, we might have been able to solve it. But it was just stuff going between CLG and DFT. The policies are just not particularly harmonious.
Yeah, and that's got to be, and it's a discussion I have a lot on Twitter. It's just that housing and transport are fundamentally interlinked sets of policies. Okay, there's individual things, like there are individual things that maybe don't, but in reality, almost any transport policy has an impact on housing policy. You know, ticketing has an impact. Any policy you can pick will have an influence, and the lack of connectivity there is a major. Yeah, that feels like a major problem. Some of the other things you picked out is it's worth saying, and I don't like flying the Union flag too often, particularly at the moment, but it is worth saying that, and you've picked this out, is that the processes we have, the analytical processes we have, are at the forefront of international practice. That is actually an interesting point of observation. We are, even if there are problems, we are still quite good at doing the analytical processes behind coming up with policy decisions. That's an interesting conclusion. And another positive thing is about the fact that there is no authoritative academic community. So actually, yeah. So I was wrong earlier about the Big Four. Actually, I suppose this is referring to the ITS in Leeds and sort of Imperial and some of these other kind of university groups, kind of subgroups within universities that focus on transport policy. So those are interesting. And then you talk about the low turnover of people in the DFT. That's a surprising conclusion, to be honest. But
it's all relative.
Yeah.
So with the background in local government, the turnover in DFT is much higher than in local government. But if you compare it to the Treasury or the Cabinet Office or CLG, it's relatively lower at DFT.
Yeah. But then some of the downside things. So we've already talked about the fact that the evidence crossing multiple departments is inconsistently used. So significant analytical capability and preponderance of economists in the DFT, which means that other forms of evidence can appear neglected in transport decision making. That feels very vivid. So social research, evaluation, or indeed engineering. That's really interesting. And so the next thing. So these are key. I suppose these are the key conclusions that I pulled out. So the next set is about the fact that the way evidence is used in decision making is not transparent. And for me, democratic. In a democracy, particularly the social democracy that I'd quite like us to live in, for me, transparency is key. And that doesn't mean dragging out projects by another 10 years or so that everyone can have their say. But we can, as a government, government can be, and as policymakers, government can be more innovative in the way that it reaches out to the public and makes things more clear and more easy for the public to scrutinise, journalists to scrutinise. Are those the themes that you sort of pulled out in this conclusion then? You've said that you don't think that decision-making is transparent, or the way that evidence is used in decision-making is transparent. And what else, kind of anything else you want to say around that?
Yeah, I think we don't really see why it shouldn't be, particularly stuff like publishing business cases. You could theoretically request them all under environmental information regulation or freedom of information, nominally. So we think a lot of the debates about regional investment, does TAG prioritise north or south, does it prioritise X or Y, it could be really easily solved if the DFT just committed to publishing that information.
As an open data set, just any project that kind of went through as a DFT funded thing was just on a database of business case and of that. Yeah, that it'd be incredibly useful it'd be interesting from an analysis perspective, if nothing else, to look at those. Kelly.
And we saw it being done, like, so in the Netherlands, as a requirement to publish the business cases. In New Zealand, it's very, very open, including kind of publishing cabinet briefings and so on. So it's kind of, I think the comparators just really showed that it can be done, and that, none of them spoke about that as a negative or kind of talked about that as a real kind of constraint on them.
Interesting. So there's the idea here. So then the next bullet point ties into it, which is the idea that modelling and economic appraisal is a pretty complicated black box, that its scrutiny and openness is therefore limited. Again, it's like very highly technical professionals. This kind of leads into something that I'm pushing on. Basically a theme that I want to pick up a bit more later this year, actually, is about the fact that the actual tools, and it can't just be analytical tools, but the actual tools are often expensive bits of kit to actually get the licenses for these. And that's a blocker. If you've got a local community organisation that is interested in maybe developing a proper business case, they always have the numbers stacked against them, because they can't, against other kind of projects that perhaps have the involvement of larger organisations, because they don't have access to these tools. And that's problematic and often can be discriminatory, in a kind of a, maybe not legally, but sort of certainly it ends up in entrenching existing kind of problems, shall we say.
Cycling's the best example here. So Robin Lovelace and Rachel Aldred and other people have done a lot of work on developing new cycling sort of appraisal bits and pieces.
Propensity
so
cycle tool,
PCT and other bits and bobs that are kind of all open data, or they're all on GitHub. It would be really good, really hard to do, but it'd be really good to see other modes of transport following down that route. So
watch this space is all I'm going to say about that, without wanting to drop Robin in it. Anyway, right, so next, so evaluation is inconsistent, but you point out that this is the same for all of the countries you examined. That there's this inconsistency. You're both nodding. Kelly, do you want to talk a little bit about that then?
Sure. I mean, I think every single interviewee we spoke to mentioned ex post evaluation as a problem. Actually, many of them mentioned kind of Highways England as a kind of example of good international practice that they would look to, but that, for various reasons, often political, but also just kind of resource reasons, it was just not happening. There's just not the political will for it, whether it's kind of worried about kind of looking kind of, I think as well, there'd be issues, around kind of how long these schemes take. There was often, that the new politicians would be in, and so there wasn't, as you said, there wasn't the political appetite for it. And when they're investing money, no one wanted to announce that they were investing money into looking at something that had already been done that was probably expensive in the first place. Yeah. So we heard a lot about kind of the reasons why it wasn't being done. Without a huge amount of great examples of it happening, a lot of commitments to do it more. I think New Zealand's new strategy commits to doing more evaluation, and we heard a lot of that kind of discussion, but without a huge amount of concrete examples. Alistair, if you want to come in on that.
Yeah, I totally agree. We heard 50 different people complaining that evaluation wasn't very good in transport. And if you go and look at the OECD sort of reports they've written, it's just not very good in transport. In transport, we are very interested in scheme appraisal. We love spending millions and millions and millions of pounds on complicated scheme appraisal. We then sort of build it and then dust our hands off and wander off and go and build the next scheme. We're much less interested in coming back 5 years later and saying, did this scheme, actually have people travelling on it, let alone transform the economy of the region like we said it would. But that's not just the UK. That is absolutely everyone.
It's interesting that because and the key example I use in the UK is and it's not an isolated case actually. Generally, rail projects this happens, but the Borders Railway is my favourite example because it was it was kneecapped early on because there was a perception that it wouldn't be very well used. The business case was all saying it's not going to be well used. All the modelling suggests this. Actually, possibly someone who watches the show and certainly is on Twitter. So someone involved in that process pushed back, but even so, the project was sort of hampered with, rather than being double track throughout, it had or at least having longer double track sections, and the signalling was all kind of designed for much lower capacities. All of that's been a problem because it's massively exceeded its predicted ridership numbers. And that's not an isolated case. We understand that. We understand the impacts of, for example, rolling stock cascades. So, Rob Warrens of Northern will talk about the massive improvement in ridership he saw almost the day they introduced the new. In fact, they're not new. The refurbished electric trains in Manchester made a massive difference to ridership. That's not an obvious big infrastructure project. That's just a new train appearing, having a massive. The new Transpennine Express trains that added, nominally added a couple of extra coaches before the timetable collapsed in on itself back in 2018. Again, it released basically all of the new capacity was immediately swallowed up by this constraint, and we're not observing this. There's to my mind, no one is looking at understanding what these. There's some analysis within the train operating companies in this case, but there's, as you say, we're not learning from that. We're not updating models based on that.
I think, I agree. I think one of our recommendations is it's not a formal recommendation there, but it's in the text to unlock PDFH. Like we don't. If in the post-Williams world, assuming we have a different rail system, I don't understand why the passenger demand forecasting handbook should be within the domain of the operating companies and delivery group and Network Rail and others. It should, like TAG, love it or hate it, it's at least all online and it links to all the underlying evidence. So I think if you unlock PDFH, that might help some of these debates.
Absolutely, yeah. There is no conceivable reason for it to, particularly now that franchising's collapsed. There's no conceivable reason for that to be hidden away, and it just means that we can't make proper future decisions. It's David Frankel. Yeah, you're right about the TP coaches. Yeah, the 2018 thing that happened later. Thanks, David Frankel, for keeping me right on my anachronistic recent transport history. See, the chat keep me right all the time. What can I say? Right, good grief. I see I've waffled and now we've got 5 minutes before it's past. Okay, what can we learn from overseas? I'm going to just sit that title there and both of you, do you both want to cut in with some of the things you reckon? Kelly, you're looking like you're about to tell me something. No, you've retracted. Well, if either of you want to talk a bit about what we could learn from overseas, and then I'll jump to the recommendations.
Yeah, I'll give it a go. So I'll say we need to think about uncertainty more. We are in a pretty uncertain world, but we have transport projects that we have a very fixed view of what the future is going to be, and we're not very good at considering what different futures might be like, or what kinds of projects that we could build that are resilient to different kinds of futures. So we talk a bit about real options analysis in there, which is just like a fancy way of saying preserving flexibility. The classic one in rail is like buying a wider tract of land than you need in case you need to double the track later.
Yep.
So we need to have a more better understanding of uncertainty and more flexible approach. And I think kind of going right back to the start, it would be helpful if the UK had a more, or England had a more stated transport strategy. At the very least, we argue that it needs to update the national policy statements, which are the most important documents that no one's ever read, because they govern all of the national significant infrastructure projects. So all your big road and rail projects, they are out of date. They don't account for climate change very well, or post 2018 commitments. They don't account for air quality or levelling up or So I think at the very least they need to be updated. Those are what we'd take from overseas. It was striking that everywhere else had some form of cross-modal strategy or investment plan.
Yeah. For me, the main thing the flag I like to wave is, the banner I like to wave is, have a plan, for God's sake, we need a plan. And that just always feels like something that we're fundamentally lacking in, no longer in the UK, as you say, in England. Before we jump to recommendations, Kelly, anything else you want to pick up on that, or do you think are you happy that's kind of?
I think the other thing was the culture of openness, which I talked about a little bit before, and kind of the New Zealand publish cabinet briefings that we said would not suit the UK's setup. I think they would get a lot of pushback on that, but in terms of business cases and things, I think there's definitely things we can draw from abroad, and just how those are treated and the attitudes around their production.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and the kind of the last thing you talk about in the conclusions here, and it's kind of interesting, is this highly centralized nature of the approach to transport. And you say that there are some advantages. It's good for the use of evidence, scale. There are benefits to scale, embedding expertise, having robust structures. But the idea, this is the thing that I find stupid. So, I did an episode a few episodes ago was about the West Yorkshire mass transit system, right? Now, it's 4 billion, and they talk about 4 billion quid, but that 4 billion quid isn't just automatically being made available for that, a project that clearly is of benefit, so just fund it. No, they're bidding against other parts of the country that also have an obvious and desperate need for transport investment. I mean, okay, we're getting into economics here, and the idea that there is austerity politics is nonsense, and there is no magical limit on how much we can fund, at least not within the realms of the numbers we're currently talking about. Okay, if I decided that I was going to pave every single road in solar panels in Britain, then we might start risking some sort of strange inflation effects. But spending a little minor fractions of percentage extra on GDP on mass transit that will grow our economy rapidly in a way that we otherwise are stagnating is a no-brainer. Anyway, park that. It's really interesting that you pull that out. You pull out the fact that the idea of local governments having to bid for funding from central government is just not a good use of. It's not a good use of evidence, and there are other consequences.
It leads to strange, perverse incentives where local governments are incentivized to put in or sort of amend schemes that they think would be politically favourable. And I think from an evidence point of view, a lack of local government funding sort of hinders their ability to collect and use evidence. So all the organisations that we think of outside national government as having a really good attitude to evidence and data and analysis. So TfL, West Midlands Combined Authority, Midlands Connect, TFN, Greater Manchester, they fund that with long-term kind of devolved funding settlements that they can then use to put into evidence that they can then turn into making good cases for stuff and getting money. And then there comes that virtuous cycle. And that is kind of one of the key things for us from the report. And I think Tom picked us up on this in his thread, and there is some merit to it. We didn't get into the UK sort of underperformance at a city region level compared to other OECD countries. We could have done, but I think that is one of the reasons is that we don't have that culture of putting things together, either making funding bids or being awarded the funding and then developing and then going on. It's all very stop-start, and that hinders using evidence well.
I should have gone a bit flicky screen. I'm going to jump to the recommendations, because we've talked about some of the issues, we've talked about some of the things that work well, but how do we make change? What are the good ideas that would make change that you've found out? So, which leads us to we'll end on or we'll nearly end on the recommendations. So I've jumped. It's not many pages, just 2 pages of recommendations. So, if you want to talk through those recommendations reasonably briefly.
Kelly, do you want to do ministers now? Do the department?
Sure. So hang on.
Sorry, I jumped out of page 10. It's my fault. I'm jumping us around unhelpfully.
No, I just sometimes for some reason my screen gets stuck on Alistair and doesn't switch back.
Terrible.
Just for reference. We split the recommendations by who they would be affecting, and so ministers, DfT, Parliament, and kind of the other bodies. So for ministers, we recommended that the ministers and SROs retained evaluation responsibility for large projects and policies after delivery, and then the Transport Select Committee could then recall them and question them about that, as we said, kind of with turnover and lack of political will for evaluation. Then giving that kind of better sense of ownership we thought would really help. And then otherwise, we were saying that they should be offered, ministers and SPADs who are involved in transport policy should be offered formal training in kind of the use of transport evidence, more broadly, kind of the principles underlying it. We didn't kind of conclude who exactly should be kind of giving that that training. Could be kind of whoever's most suitable, but that should become part of the culture.
Absolutely, yeah, that's really good. Yeah, that the idea of the TSC being able to recall, so getting Grayling back, or and quizzing them about certain things. Yeah, that feels like a sensible recommendation. Okay, so on to the DFT.
So I'll give it a go. So we've got the first one is on the national policy statements and the new national strategy, if they should at least think about it, and then the other one is that they should publish the strategic economic cases for these projects, and they should make it indexed and easily searchable. And I think this was us pushing the boat out a bit, but we said ideally they should record how the forms of evidence were weighed, because you get all of this going into a minister or a senior civil servant, and then you just get a decision coming out of it. You don't have an understanding of, well, actually they looked at economics more than distribution, or they looked at distribution analysis more than economics. That would be ideal. Then the PDFH point we sort of raised that should be opened up, and that local government and regional government should have ring-fenced money for evaluation.
Okay, so it's not for building
money.
Things, but for actually evaluating what when they have built something, what that ends up achieving.
Yeah, so basically, currently you get a capital project and you get money for the capital project, but you've got to on your own will and money go back a year and 5 years afterwards to go out and work out whether it worked or not, and there's no incentives to do that.
Yeah.
And then the final one is about skills, where we argued that the DFT should send more people to and from local and regional government and delivery agencies as well. We think that would be helpful in terms of getting a better understanding of local policy, and also getting more analytical capability into other tiers of government.
Nice one. And so the last two, so you kind of recommendations for both Parliament and for the professional bodies and transport organisations. So you kind of say that that the TSC should carry out regular evidence checks on. Yeah.
So they should come out. They should do some inquiries on just the evidence underlying a policy. They've got a good one on young and novice drivers that they've done recently. But they should just pick a policy, any policy, and just get everyone in and say, okay, what's the foundation of this policy? What's the evidence underlying it? How do we get where we are on speed limits or whatever it might be? And that would be really helpful for getting evidence in, and it should take a greater role in evaluation, ideally as well. And the fines about professional, because there's not really always a kind of local sufficient scale, so they're quite specialist things to do. So ideally, the professional bodies and sort of regional governance could take a role in pooling that knowledge and evidence, so they could do stuff on behalf of local authorities or regional authorities. So TFN could do an evaluation on behalf of Greater Manchester or Liverpool, because they could have the number of staff to do it.
And then the last recommendations are to the professional bodies and to some of the transport organisations.
Yeah, and that's just that one again. That's just saying they need to pool knowledge and resources and use their economy of scale for that evaluation.
So we've rushed a little bit at the end there because my time management is hopeless. But actually, there's a huge amount of really valuable stuff in this report. I'm going to go back and pick out the two sentences that are in the conclusion that I thought were really interesting. But actually, this isn't the sum total of what's in the report. There's a lot of really interesting and valuable stuff. I just want to say to both of you that it's a fantastic report, really, really interesting. There's a lot of stuff that a lot of people in the chat here are very interested in. I picked through it in detail, and I will refer to it in various bits of writing and things that I do, because there's so much useful information in there, and also lots of rabbit holes I see that are perhaps ones that you kind of stepped over, or some of the ones that I sort of spot in some of there's some between the lines, like, oh, I bet they wanted to do some more stuff on that I've kind of got my brain buzzing on interesting ideas, to things to think about on this. But I just want to pick this quote out, really, which is in the conclusion, which is the way evidence is used in decision making is not transparent, and this is linked to the fact that scrutiny and openness is limited. That feels like a fairly poignant sentence to summarise the UK approach. It's not all bad. There's some good stuff, but there are challenges. Let's see if this works, which it is working. Hooray! I'm gonna just is there anything else you want to add before I whiz into the kind of the closing remarks or anything you want to plug? Actually, is there anything you want to plug?
Kelly, any reports coming out?
Nothing coming out very soon. I've just co-authored a report on an independent Scotland, the EU, and the Anglo-Scottish border.
Oh,
so if anyone is interested in that, that's just come out.
It's a firestorm.
But yeah, no, thanks so much for having us on. This has been great.
Yeah. Sorry, it went horribly extended. Sorry, go on, Alistair.
No, I would say we're delighted. We're happy to talk about this report at length. It was fun to write, even if it took a while. So we're really glad that you and the chat are both pretty happy with going through it.
There's a lot of very interesting stuff. Indeed. So I'm going to whiz over to my usual sort of closing remarks, and then we'll whiz back to yourselves. Chuck in the questions in the chat. We've got no minutes at all, but if there's any quick questions that I reckon can be answered quickly, we'll maybe do that. First of all, thanks to everyone who's listening to this in podcast form, in audio-only form. We're available on everywhere that you can get podcasts somehow by the power of magic and technology. These apparently, John Stone says the PDF ones hang up pretty well, so if John, hi, I know you listen to these. So let me know feedback, and I'll try things I can do to make the audio work better that don't compromise the visuals, blah, blah, blah. But thanks for everyone who's listening. As ever, you can support me on Patreon to make more of this happen. Go to patreon.com/Gareth Dennis, and you can choose future themes. You can suggest guests. This was a suggested, the Patreon people suggested this episode. Very glad that you did. And then also you can do that on the Discord, garethdennis.co.uk/Discord. And if you don't fancy any of that, you just want to throw me a penny or two because you enjoyed this episode, then you can do that via PayPal, paypal.me/GarethDennis. I always feel uncomfortable in the ads, but as pointed out by my Patreon producers, it's important because these things, it means that this continues to happen, and I quite enjoy doing this stuff. Next week, relevant to some of the stuff we've just talked about, we're doing what the Welsh railway maps should look like. That's next week's episode 57 of Rail Natter. What should the Welsh railway map look like? If I'm going to take a couple of approaches. I'm going to do, if it was a blank slate, what would the railway network look like? And if we were going to actually realistically update it, what would it look like? That could be interesting. Have fun with me keeping that to an hour. Anyway, back to our three faces here of our guests. We have David Shepherd has asked. Is asking about if you had a look. Did you have a look at any of the big project studies, or did you just base the report mostly on evidence from interviewees, or did you have a look at some of the big projects in these other countries and how they looked?
Yeah, we had a look at some of the projects. So the Batuva route is an example we looked at in the Netherlands, sort of famously controversial overrunning thing as well. We were looking a bit at high-speed rail in Sweden. There's an interesting quote in the report where someone was saying that the government priorities for high-speed rail with pretty poor BCRs shows that they don't care about BCRs, and that sends a kind of different, a chill through the department. So we looked at some of the sort of the interesting projects that we found in those countries that kind of typified some of the approaches.
Okay. So Owen, it's a good question, but it's kind of like an ethereal one that I don't think any of us can answer, which is, why would a politician go for a system that's more evidence-based when it potentially tie their hands to implement party politics? Well, this is about transparency, isn't it? If we're more transparent, I think you overcome that challenge, right?
The outcomes are better, right? So transparency is painful to begin with, but it drives you to have better outcomes. So Kelly was speaking about New Zealand publishing like various papers openly to cabinet and stuff. And people were saying that kind of drives them to be kind of think about things and consider evidence, because they know it's going to be in the public domain and they know they're going to be scrutinized. Yeah. So it drives you to have better outcomes.
And also, if evidence-based means that unless there's a particular, there are a few people in politics, I'm sure, who have really strong ideological plans for why they don't want to do certain things, but ultimately, better transport makes people happier and makes their lives better, and then they want to vote for you. So if you have more evidence, you drive better outcomes. That's a good thing. Politicians like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we said as well that then, if you're not publishing any of this stuff, there'll be misconceptions and certain like ways people perceive the system to work. And if that's not actually how it works, if there's not biases or something, the best way to actually say that is not to just keep saying no, but to show it.
Yeah.
I think
the argument about whether like BCRs benefit the North or the South is mostly based on a debate around a report published in 2006 and projects that were from 2003 to 6. And I was in school then, and I'm in my mid-30s now. So like we shouldn't be having that debate. Like we should be publishing these things so we can have these intelligent sort of discussions that are informed.
The evidence is what allows us to move on, right? If people, once the evidence is there, is transparent, is disseminated well, clearly, and is clear to understand as well. It's critical that it's in a way that's clear for people to understand. Then, yeah, we can move on from all the kind of rock chucking and actually agree on. If we all agree on the frame of reference, then we can move forward. Absolutely, I think that's a nice thing to close off on. Everyone, thanks in the chat. You've all been brilliant. I know there are lots of questions and discussions going on there, but I've already dragged 40 extra minutes out of these lovely people. So, and Kelly and Alistair, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for going through that with us.
Thank you.
And I will. I'll see everyone. I'll see everyone next week. And yeah, cheerio, everyone. Cheerio.